The whispered confession shattered her romantic expectations. "My kids are outside." Rachel's heart stuttered at Owen's words, fear mingling with something else in his eyes. Single mom answered the door. Excited for her date, but instead of disappointment, she felt a strange recognition. Two broken families standing at the threshold of something unexpected. Her invitation came without hesitation, instinct overriding caution. Some wounds can only be healed by those who understand their depth. Rachel Monroe smoothed her navy dress for what must have been the 20th time, catching her reflection in the hallway mirror as she paced back and forth across the worn wooden floors of her modest bungalow. The dress had been an impulse purchase, hanging forgotten in her closet for nearly 2 years since the day she'd optimistically bought it, back when she still believed romance might someday find its way back into her life. Tonight felt different somehow, more significant than the handful of disappointing dates she'd reluctantly endured over the years since Michael had walked away, leaving nothing behind but a hastily scrawled note and a deafening silence that had threatened to swallow her whole in those first terrible months. Her son Finn was spending the night at his grandmother's house, his overnight bag packed with the careful attention only an 8-year-old could muster, each item meticulously chosen and arranged with exacting precision. Rachel had watched him pack, marveling at how much of her own mother she saw in him, that same methodical nature, the need for order in a world that so often provided none. She'd asked him twice if he was really okay with her going on a date, carefully studying his face for signs of the discomfort he so often tried to hide. But he had simply shrugged and told her that Grandma had promised to make chocolate chip pancakes in the morning. His priorities clearly established and uncomplicated in the way only children's could be. Owen Grant had seemed different from the moment she'd reluctantly agreed to meet him for coffee 3 weeks ago, after endless encouragement from her friend Sophia, who worked with him at the architectural firm downtown. Their initial conversation had stretched from a planned 30-minute coffee break into nearly 3 hours of talking, sharing stories about their lives with an ease that had surprised Rachel. Accustomed as she was to the awkward silences and forced conversations of first meetings, he hadn't flinched when she mentioned Finn, hadn't made those subtle but unmistakable expressions of retreat that she'd learned to recognize on men's faces when they realized she came with attachments and responsibilities they weren't prepared to consider. The warehouse she managed required long hours and constant problem-solving, leaving little time or energy for dating. But Owen had been persistent in the gentlest possible way, suggesting times that would work with her schedule, offering to bring lunch to her office when she couldn't get away. There was a patience to him that Rachel found both comforting and slightly unnerving, so different from Michael's restless energy that it always left her feeling slightly breathless, always one step behind. She'd finally agreed to dinner at her place, a compromise that allowed her to maintain some control over the situation, while still taking the step forward that she'd been so hesitant to make for so long. The kitchen timer chimed softly, pulling Rachel from her thoughts and back to the present moment where the scent of roasting vegetables filled the small house, with a warmth that matched the late summer evening outside. She had decided on a simple meal, nothing too elaborate or pretentious, just honest food that felt like a natural extension of the conversations they'd already shared. The bottle of wine she'd splurged on stood waiting on the counter, alongside the glasses she'd inherited from her grandmother, their delicate stems a reminder of celebrations past and, perhaps, celebrations yet to come. If she could only quiet the anxious voice inside her that insisted this would end like all the others. The doorbell's chime sent a jolt through Rachel's body, momentarily freezing her in place as the reality of the evening suddenly crystallized around her. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dress one final time before walking to the door with measured steps, coaching herself silently to maintain the calm confidence she'd practiced in her mind a dozen times. Her fingers hesitated just briefly on the doorknob before she pulled it open with a smile that she hoped concealed the nervous flutter in her stomach. Coming face to face with Owen, whose own smile seemed to carry a tension she hadn't expected, his eyes holding something unreadable that caused her own smile to falter just slightly as she stepped back to invite him inside. Owen stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the golden evening light that spilled across her porch, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch between them like questions unasked. Rachel noticed immediately that something was different about him tonight. His shoulders held a tension that hadn't been present during their previous meetings, and his eyes darted briefly away from hers before meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He was dressed simply but carefully in dark jeans and a button-down shirt the color of stormy skies, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he'd run his hands through it repeatedly on the drive over. A nervous habit she'd noticed during their coffee date. Before she could fully process the shift in his demeanor, Owen leaned slightly toward her, close enough that she could smell the faint trace of his cologne mingled with something that reminded her of fresh laundry and home. His voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, the words falling between them with the weight of a confession. "My kids are outside in the car." The statement hung in the warm evening air, transforming the space between them into something altogether different than what Rachel had been anticipating just moments before. She felt her carefully constructed expectations for the evening reorganizing themselves, shifting and realigning to accommodate this new reality, as she looked past him to the silver sedan parked at the curb, where she could just make out the shadowy outlines of small figures in the back seat. Rachel recognized the look in Owen's eyes now. It was one she had seen countless times in her own mirror, that peculiar mixture of pride and fear, of fierce love and vulnerability, that came with introducing your children to a world that might not understand their importance in your life. She thought of all the times she had hesitated to mention Finn, all the relationships that had withered at the mere mention of her son, all the carefully planned dates that had dissolved into awkward goodbyes when the reality of her life as a mother became impossible to ignore. Without allowing herself time to overthink, Rachel found herself smiling with genuine warmth as she stepped slightly to the side, opening her door wider in clear invitation. "I'm making tacos," she heard herself say with a casualness that surprised even her, the words flowing naturally as though this had been the plan all along. "There's plenty for everyone. I always make too much anyway." She watched as Owen's expression transformed, the tension in his face giving way to visible relief that made him appear suddenly younger, more open than she had ever seen him. He hesitated just a moment longer before nodding, his smile returning with a gratitude that needed no words, as he turned toward the car and raised his hand in a gesture that clearly communicated permission to approach. Rachel watched as the back doors opened and two children emerged cautiously, looking toward the house with the wary curiosity of young explorers facing unknown territory. The girl appeared to be around 10, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a serious expression that seemed too mature for her small face, as she took her younger brother's hand with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to responsibility. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, Rachel guessed, his movements animated despite his obvious attempt to behave with the decorum his sister was modeling, his sneakers lighting up with each step as they approached the porch where Owen waited, his posture now visibly relaxed though his eyes remained watchful, gauging Rachel's reaction. "This is Olivia and Max," he said simply, resting his hands lightly on their shoulders as they reached the door, the gesture both protective and reassuring. Rachel knelt down slightly to bring herself closer to eye level with the children, years of navigating Finn's social world having taught her that nothing built trust faster than treating young people with genuine respect. "I'm Rachel," she offered with a smile that held no trace of the disappointment or frustration that Owen might have feared. "And I happen to be making the best tacos in the entire state tonight. My son Finn says they're better than any restaurants, though he might be a little biased." She winked conspiratorially at Max, whose solemn expression cracked just enough to reveal the hint of a smile, as he glanced up at his father for confirmation that this unexpected turn of events was indeed acceptable. The kitchen that had earlier seemed so perfectly arranged for an intimate dinner date transformed effortlessly into a space of collaborative chaos, as Rachel pulled additional plates from cupboards, and Owen helped the children wash their hands at the sink. Max had warmed to the situation with the remarkable adaptability of young children, already chattering about his favorite dinosaurs as he carefully arranged napkins at each place setting, while Olivia maintained a more reserved demeanor, her watchful eyes taking in every detail of Rachel's home, with the careful assessment of someone who has learned to be cautious with new situations. Rachel recognized in the girl's guarded expression something familiar, the protective instinct of a child who has assumed responsibilities beyond her years, a feeling Rachel knew intimately from her own childhood after her father's death had thrust her mother into the role of single parent. Rachel moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, expanding the meal to accommodate their unexpected guests while maintaining a steady stream of casual conversation that required no specific responses, allowing the children to engage or simply listen as they became comfortable. She noticed how Owen seemed to relax more with each passing minute, the rigid set of his shoulders gradually softening as he realized that the evening hadn't been ruined by the presence of his children, but rather transformed into something entirely different, yet equally valuable. He stepped in to help without being asked, finding the extra glasses in the cabinet with an intuitive understanding of kitchen organization that spoke of years managing his own household. "My ex-wife was supposed to take them this weekend," Owen explained quietly when the children became engrossed in helping to grate cheese for the tacos, his voice low enough that only Rachel could hear. "She called an hour ago to cancel, some work emergency that couldn't wait. It's the third time this month." The resignation in his voice carried no bitterness, just a weary acceptance that spoke volumes about the frequency of such occurrences. Rachel nodded her understanding, having navigated enough last-minute changes with Michael's sporadic attempts at parenting before he'd eventually stopped trying altogether. "You could have rescheduled," she offered, not as an accusation, but as acknowledgement of the choice he'd made in bringing them. Owen's eyes met hers with unexpected intensity, his voice still quiet but firm with conviction. "I almost did, but then I thought about how I'm always telling them that honesty matters, that showing up matters, even when it's complicated." He glanced toward his children with an expression that contained such naked love that Rachel felt something shift inside her, a recognition of the rare authenticity of the man standing in her kitchen. "Besides," he added with a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "I've been looking forward to this all week." The simple admission carried a warmth that spread through Rachel's chest, settling into places that had grown cold with disuse and caution. Dinner unfolded with surprising ease, the tentative atmosphere gradually giving way to genuine laughter as Max recounted a playground adventure, with animated gestures that nearly upset his water glass twice, saved only by Olivia's quick reflexes. Rachel found herself sharing stories about Finn's recent science project disaster involving baking soda and far too much vinegar, which had left her kitchen ceiling bearing the evidence for weeks afterward. "Mom said it looked like a volcano threw up," Max announced with the delighted horror only a 6-year-old could muster at such an image, causing Owen to choke slightly on his water as he tried to suppress his laughter while maintaining parental decorum regarding appropriate dinner conversation. As the meal progressed, Rachel noticed Olivia's careful observations, the way the girl watched the interactions between the adults with an analytical gaze that seemed to be assessing and cataloging each exchange. When Rachel asked about her interests, Olivia's response was measured and articulate, describing her recent science fair project on water filtration, with a precision and knowledge that belied her age. "Dad helped with the diagrams," she acknowledged with a glance toward Owen, whose expression revealed both pride and something more complicated, perhaps recognition of his daughter's premature maturity, the childhood partially sacrificed to circumstances beyond her control. It was a look Rachel had seen in her own mirror on days when Finn demonstrated resilience that no child should need to develop so young. By the time they moved to the living room with bowls of the ice cream Rachel had been saving for dessert, a tentative comfort had established itself among them, the unexpected configuration of their evening having settled into something that felt surprisingly natural. Max had positioned himself cross-legged on the floor near Rachel's feet, his earlier reserve completely dissolved as he described in elaborate detail the plot of his favorite animated movie, While Olivia had gradually allowed her perfect posture to relax into the corner of the couch, her legs tucked underneath her as she joined the conversation with increasing animation, Rachel caught Owen's gaze across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that somehow, this improvised gathering of their fragmented families had created something neither had anticipated, but both could recognize as valuable. A moment of genuine connection that transcended the conventional boundaries of a first date. Long after the dishes had been cleared and Max had fallen asleep on the couch, his small body curled trustingly against the cushions with an abandon only children can achieve in unfamiliar surroundings, Rachel and Owen sat at the kitchen table where Olivia had spread out her sketchbook, revealing impressive drawings that showed remarkable talent for someone so young. The girl had finally relaxed enough to share this passion, her earlier reserve giving way to enthusiasm as she explained the techniques she was learning in her art class, occasionally glancing at her father for the affirming nods he readily provided. Rachel noticed how Olivia's confidence bloomed under Owen's attentive interest, the way he asked questions that demonstrated a history of engagement with her creative pursuits, rather than the performative attention some parents display for the benefit of observers. When Olivia eventually succumbed to yawns she couldn't suppress, Owen gently suggested she join her brother in rest while the adults talked a bit longer. "We should probably head home soon anyway," he added, though Rachel detected a reluctance in his voice that matched her own surprising disappointment at the thought of their evening ending. Once Olivia had settled herself on the opposite end of the couch from her brother, immediately falling into the deep sleep of exhausted youth, Owen returned to the kitchen where Rachel was wiping down counters with the automatic movements of someone who finds comfort in routine tasks. The quiet that settled between them felt companionable rather than awkward, a shared moment of peaceful aftermath following the animated chaos of dinner with children. "I should apologize," Owen finally said, his voice low to avoid disturbing the sleeping children in the next room. Rachel looked up from the counter she was wiping, raising an eyebrow in silent question that prompted him to continue. "This isn't exactly the romantic evening I had planned. I wanted." He hesitated, running a hand through his hair in that now familiar gesture of uncertainty. "I wanted to impress you, I guess. Make a good second impression after you were kind enough to agree to dinner." The confession carried a vulnerability that Rachel found far more appealing than any carefully orchestrated romantic gesture might have been, the honest admission of his disappointment revealing more about his character than a perfect evening ever could have. Rachel leaned against the counter, considering him with a thoughtful expression before responding. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, waiting for his nod before continuing. "I've been on dates where everything went according to plan. Perfect restaurant, perfect conversation, perfect goodnight kiss. And then I never heard from the guy again once he realized that my life isn't perfect, that I come with responsibilities and complications, and a child who will always be my priority." She shrugged slightly, a gesture that conveyed both the pain and acceptance of this reality. Tonight wasn't what either of us planned, but it was honest, real. I got to see who you actually are, not who you were trying to be for a night. That's worth more to me than candlelight and practiced conversation. Owen's expression shifted as he absorbed her words, the tired lines around his eyes softening into something warmer, more present. "My ex-wife, Natalie," he began, seeming to choose his words with careful precision. "She has very specific ideas about how things should look. Perfect home, perfect clothes, perfect family image." He glanced toward the living room where his children slept, his voice taking on a protective edge. The kids learned early to perform for her, to be the perfect versions of themselves she expected, hiding anything messy or complicated. It took me too long to see what that was doing to them, how they were losing themselves trying to meet impossible standards. The admission clearly cost him something, a painful recognition of his own delayed understanding. Rachel found herself sharing in return, the words flowing more easily than she had anticipated, describing Michael's gradual withdrawal after Finn's birth, his increasing absences until the day she'd returned from the grocery store to find his closet emptied, and his wedding ring placed precisely in the center of their bed. He sent divorce papers from Seattle 2 months later, she concluded, the old pain now dulled by time and perspective. Said he wasn't cut out for fatherhood, that he needed to find himself without the burden of responsibilities he'd never really wanted. She smiled wryly, an expression that held more resignation than bitterness. Finn was barely two. Too young to remember him clearly now, but old enough then to keep asking where Daddy was for months afterward. Owen reached across the table then, his hand covering hers in a gesture that offered understanding rather than pity. Natalie is still in their lives, technically, he explained, his thumb moving absently across Rachel's knuckles in a way that sent unexpected warmth up her arm. But it's on her terms, when it fits her schedule or when she needs them as accessories at some social event where the perfect family image benefits her. The edge in his voice revealed a tightly controlled anger that Rachel recognized, not the explosive rage of someone with poor self-control, but the righteous indignation of a parent who has watched their child be hurt and stands ready to prevent further damage at any cost. She tracks my car, Owen continued, the confession emerging as though he'd been holding it back for too long, needing to share this reality with someone who might understand. There's a GPS device she had installed during our marriage, claiming it was for safety, and I never got around to having it removed after the divorce. She knows where I go, who I see. The kids have learned to be careful what they mention about our weekends because she questions them about everything. The weight of constant surveillance hung heavy in his words, the exhaustion of living under perpetual scrutiny evident in the tightness around his eyes. That's part of why I was nervous about tonight. If the kids told her about meeting you, about having dinner here. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in her warm kitchen, understanding immediately the implications of his unfinished thought. She uses the children as leverage, she completed for him, the pattern painfully familiar from stories shared by other single parents in her support group. Owen nodded, a quick, sharp movement that confirmed her assessment. The current custody arrangement gives me weekends and one weeknight, but she's constantly finding reasons to change plans, to keep them longer, to create conflicts that make me look unreliable if I can't adjust instantly. He took a deep breath, squeezing Rachel's hand gently before releasing it. I've been saving for a lawyer to request a modification to get something more stable for the kids, but it's complicated. The word hung between them, encompassing years of careful navigation through emotional minefields, of children caught between adult conflicts, of patience stretched to breaking points, but somehow maintained for the sake of young hearts. Rachel recognized in Owen's controlled recounting of his situation the same measured restraint she had learned to practice when speaking about Michael, the careful editing of emotion to protect children from adult burdens while still acknowledging painful realities. In that recognition, something shifted between them, a deepening of connection beyond the surface-level attraction that had brought them together initially, a foundation of shared understanding that felt surprisingly solid for such a new relationship. The following week unfolded with a series of text messages and brief phone calls between Rachel and Owen, their conversations carrying the easy familiarity of people who have already moved past the performative stage of getting to know each other. Rachel found herself smiling at her phone more often than she could remember doing in years. Small updates about Owen's day or funny observations about workplace absurdities becoming bright points in her busy schedule. Finn had returned from his grandmother's full of questions about her date, his curiosity piqued by her uncharacteristic vagueness, and Rachel had found herself unexpectedly hesitant to share details, wanting to protect this fragile new connection from the jinxing power of too much scrutiny or expectation. By the time Friday evening arrived, bringing with it Owen's planned visit to her house with the children for a movie night that Finn had been anticipating all week, Rachel felt a nervous excitement that reminded her of adolescence, both welcome and disconcerting in its intensity. She had just finished arranging a ridiculous quantity of snacks on the coffee table, Finn's contribution to the evening's planning having centered almost exclusively around food options, when she heard her son's excited exclamation from where he'd stationed himself at the living room window as self-appointed lookout. "They're here. Mom, I think I see a dinosaur backpack." His approval was immediate, and based entirely on this observed shared interest, the simplicity of children's connection requirements making Rachel smile as she moved to open the door. Owen stood on her porch looking more relaxed than during their previous encounter, Max bouncing with barely contained energy beside him, while Olivia maintained her more reserved demeanor. Though Rachel noticed a small sketch pad clutched in the girl's hand, perhaps brought as both comfort object and potential conversation piece. Behind them in the driveway sat Owen's silver sedan, now familiar from their previous meeting, its presence a concrete reminder of the reality they were creating, not the fantasy dating scenario of two unattached adults, but the complex merging of lives already rich with connections and complications. Rachel felt a surprising surge of contentment at the sight, a recognition that this messier reality contained depths the fantasy could never achieve. Later, after the younger boys had fallen asleep halfway through the second movie, despite their insistence that they could stay awake all night if necessary, and Olivia had curled up with her sketchbook in the corner of the couch, her pencil moving in steady strokes across the paper, Rachel and Owen stepped onto the back porch for a few moments of adult conversation. The autumn night carried a pleasant coolness after the lingering summer heat of recent weeks, the sky above them clear enough to reveal a scattering of stars despite the city lights. They stood side by side at the railing, shoulders almost touching in the comfortable silence that had become a hallmark of their interactions, neither feeling the need to fill every moment with words. "Finn seems like a great kid," Owen finally offered, his voice carrying genuine appreciation rather than the obligatory compliment some might extend. "He's got this amazing enthusiasm for everything, but especially for sharing what he knows. The way he was explaining all those dinosaur facts to Max." He shook his head slightly, smiling. "That kind of natural teaching ability is special. He must get that from you." The observation carried a perceptiveness that touched Rachel unexpectedly, recognition of qualities in her son that she valued deeply, but that often went unnoticed by others, who saw only his energy and exuberance, rather than the thoughtfulness beneath. Rachel felt the compliment warm her from within as she leaned slightly against the porch railing, considering her response. "He's always been that way, wanting to share whatever he's passionate about. His teachers say he's a great classroom helper with other students." Pride colored her voice as she spoke of her son, the unguarded moment revealing how deeply intertwined her identity had become with her role as Finn's mother. "It hasn't always been easy for him, though. When Michael left..." She paused, the old pain briefly resurfacing before she continued. "Finn went through a period where he stopped talking almost entirely. 3 months of near silence that terrified me. The child psychologist said it was his way of processing trauma he couldn't verbalize." Owen's hand found hers on the railing, his fingers interlacing with her own in a gesture of support that required no words. Olivia developed severe anxiety after the divorce. He offered in return, the shared vulnerability creating balance between them. Perfectionism that went far beyond normal childhood desire to please. The school counselor finally helped me understand that she was trying to control everything she possibly could because so much felt out of her control. His thumb traced small circles against Rachel's palm as he spoke, the gentle motion grounding them both in the present moment, even as they revisited difficult memories. Max was younger when it happened, like Finn, but he started having nightmares that continued for almost a year. The parallels in their experiences created a bridge between them, shared understanding that required no elaborate explanations. "It's different, isn't it?" Rachel asked softly, her gaze fixed on the distant pinpricks of starlight above them. "When you're a parent going through something like that, you don't just feel your own pain, you feel theirs too, maybe even more intensely, and you can't fall apart completely because they need you to keep everything stable." Owen's nod was visible from the corner of her eye, acknowledgement of the unique burden of parenting through personal crisis, the requirement to maintain functionality, regardless of internal chaos for the sake of children who depend entirely on that stability. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as the evening progressed, sharing stories of parenting triumphs and mishaps with the comfortable exchange of veterans who recognize in each other the battle scars of similar experiences. When Owen checked his watch and reluctantly suggested it was time to gather his sleeping children for the drive home, Rachel felt a surprising reluctance to see the evening end. Their goodbye at the door held a new quality of connection, Owen's hand lingering against hers as he thanked her for hosting them, his eyes conveying more than his casual words expressed. Rachel watched from the doorway as he carefully buckled Max into the back seat, the boy never fully waking from his movie-induced slumber, while Olivia climbed in with the self-sufficiency of someone accustomed to managing herself. As Owen's car backed out of her driveway, headlights briefly illuminating the front of her house before sweeping away into the darkness, Rachel noticed something that caused her to step forward with a frown, squinting to confirm what she thought she'd seen. There, just visible in the retreating glow of the taillights, was a small dark object attached to the underside of Owen's rear bumper, its presence so subtle it would be invisible, unless one happened to be looking from exactly the right angle. The GPS tracker Owen had mentioned during their previous conversation, she realized with a cold certainty, physical evidence of the monitoring he lived with daily. Rachel stood watching until the car disappeared around the corner, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach as she considered the implications of such constant surveillance, the invasive violation of privacy it represented, and the potential complications it might create for their developing relationship. The GPS tracker continued to occupy Rachel's thoughts throughout the following days, its existence a tangible manifestation of the control dynamics Owen had described in his relationship with his ex-wife. During their phone conversations, she carefully avoided mentioning what she'd seen, uncertain whether drawing attention to her discovery might create additional complications for Owen, yet feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the knowledge she now possessed. The warehouse management crisis that consumed her work week provided temporary distraction, supply chain issues and staffing shortages creating enough immediate problems to push personal concerns temporarily to the background. But in quiet moments, the image of that small, dark device returned to her mind with troubling persistence. By the time Wednesday evening arrived, bringing with it Owen's midweek visitation with his children and their planned dinner at a local pizza place that featured both dinosaur-themed play areas for the younger boys and art activities that might interest Olivia, Rachel had reached a decision. The casual setting would provide opportunities for the children to be occupied, while allowing the adults brief periods of conversation, a perfect environment for addressing concerns without creating undue tension or drama that might affect the children's enjoyment of their limited time together. She arrived early, securing a corner booth that offered some privacy while still providing clear sightlines to the play area, where Finn would inevitably spend most of his time, his excitement about seeing Max again having dominated his conversation for days. Owen arrived with his children in tow, Max immediately spotting Finn and racing toward him with the uninhibited enthusiasm of new friendship, while Olivia offered Rachel a small smile that revealed growing comfort with her presence in their lives. Rachel noticed immediately that Owen appeared more tired than during their previous encounters, faint shadows beneath his eyes suggesting nights of limited sleep, though his greeting carried genuine warmth as he slid into the booth beside her, their shoulders brushing briefly in a gesture that felt both casual and intentional. The children's orders were taken and activities distributed, coloring sheets for the younger boys who insisted they needed fuel before play, and a more complex drawing challenge that caught Olivia's interest immediately, creating a bubble of focused attention that allowed the adults a moment of relative privacy. "You look exhausted," Rachel observed quietly, keeping her tone conversational rather than accusatory, an opening that invited explanation without demanding it. Owen glanced toward her with a rueful smile that acknowledged the accuracy of her assessment, his hand moving automatically to the back of his neck, in a gesture she'd come to recognize as indicative of tension he was trying to manage. "Natalie showed up at my apartment last night," he explained, voice pitched low enough that the children remained oblivious to the conversation. Unannounced, after the kids were already asleep, said she needed to discuss changes to the visitation schedule for next month, but wouldn't tell me what changes until I let her inside. The controlled frustration in his voice revealed layers of complex history, the careful navigation required when dealing with someone who wielded both emotional and practical power, over aspects of his life through their shared connection to the children. She stayed for almost 2 hours, he continued, absently turning his water glass in slow circles as he spoke, asking questions about where we'd been over the weekend, who we'd seen, what we'd done, making it sound like casual interest in the kids' activities, but he trailed off, glancing up to meet Rachel's eyes with a look that confirmed she understood the actual motivation behind such detailed inquiry. When she finally left, it was after midnight and I couldn't get back to sleep afterward. Rachel nodded her understanding, recognizing the familiar pattern of control tactics that survivors of emotionally manipulative relationships had described in the support group she'd briefly attended after Michael's departure. "Owen," she began carefully, conscious of the children nearby despite their apparent absorption in their respective activities. "I saw something the other night when you were leaving my house." She paused, assessing his reaction before continuing. "Under your car, the tracker you mentioned, I actually saw it." The admission hung between them for a moment, Owen's expression shifting through surprise to resignation and finally settling into something harder, more resolved than she'd seen from him previously. "I've known it was there for years," he acknowledged, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of long-term accommodation to invasion. "During the marriage, it was presented as a safety measure. What if the car broke down with the kids inside? Wouldn't I want Natalie to be able to find us quickly?" He shook his head slightly at the memory. "It seemed reasonable at the time, or I convinced myself it was. After the divorce, there was so much chaos, so many battles over every detail of the separation agreement, that removing it just fell to the bottom of a very long priority list." The explanation carried no defensiveness, simply the honest recognition of choices made during difficult circumstances, priorities assessed and addressed according to their perceived importance at the time. Rachel leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping even lower, though the children remained thoroughly distracted by their activities. "Have you considered that she might be using it to document your movements for the custody case, creating a record of everywhere you go to use against you somehow?" The possibility had clearly occurred to Owen before, his lack of surprise at her suggestion confirming as much. But something in his expression shifted as she spoke, a crystallization of thoughts previously unformed or unacknowledged. "I work in logistics," Rachel continued, following the thread of her emerging idea. "Tracking systems and documentation are literally what I do all day. If you wanted to create counter-documentation, evidence of how the tracker is being used inappropriately." The arrival of their pizza interrupted the conversation momentarily, the children's attention immediately shifting to the food as the server distributed plates and took drink refill orders. Once the initial excitement had settled, and Finn and Max had received permission to take their first slices to the play area, supervised by Olivia, who had been entrusted with this responsibility with appropriate gravity, Rachel and Owen were able to continue their discussion with relative privacy. "I've thought about removing it," Owen admitted, "but part of me worries that would just escalate things. Natalie doesn't respond well to direct confrontation. It tends to make situations worse rather than better. And if I'm honest, there's been a certain advantage to letting her think she has this control. It keeps her focused on my movements rather than finding new ways to interfere." Rachel considered this perspective, recognizing the complex calculations that went into managing such relationships, particularly when children were involved. "What if," she suggested after a thoughtful pause, "instead of removing it, we documented its existence and how it's being used, created a record showing the pattern of surveillance?" She reached for her phone, pulling up her calendar application to illustrate her point. "Look at last Friday. She called you about a work emergency that prevented her from taking the kids for her scheduled weekend. But according to this device, she knew exactly where you were. She could see you were at my house, probably assumed you were on a date, and deliberately disrupted your plans." The suggestion caught Owen's full attention, his expression sharpening with interest as he considered the implications. "My lawyer mentioned that evidence of parental interference could be significant in a custody modification request. he acknowledged, the possibility clearly gaining traction in his mind. But how would we document it effectively? I can't prove she's actually checking the tracker data, just that the device exists. Rachel smiled then, the expression carrying a confidence born of professional expertise in exactly the systems being discussed. That's where my warehouse management experience comes in handy, she explained. I deal with tracking systems every day, documenting chain of custody, movement patterns, verification protocols. I think we could create a pretty compelling record if we approached it systematically. Their conversation continued as they ate, developing the outline of a documentation strategy that would create a verifiable record of both the tracker's existence and the pattern of interference that corresponded with Owen's movements. By the time the children returned to the table, flushed with the exertion of play and ready for second helpings of pizza, the adults had established the beginnings of a plan that felt both practical and empowering, transforming a tool of control into potential evidence that might ultimately lead to greater stability for Owen and his children. Rachel noticed that Owen sat straighter now, the exhaustion in his features partially replaced by renewed determination, the possibility of constructive action providing energy that simple endurance could not sustain. As they prepared to leave the restaurant later, the children exchanging elaborate goodbyes despite knowing they would see each other again in just a few days for a planned park outing, Rachel felt Owen's hand briefly catch hers, the touch conveying gratitude that required no words. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that communicated far more than the casual phrase might suggest to outside observers. "For seeing what's happening and not just—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Not just writing it off as divorce drama or telling me to just get over it like some people have." The genuine appreciation in his voice confirmed for Rachel that her instincts had been correct, that the connection forming between them contained something more substantial than mere attraction or convenience, a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that felt increasingly valuable. The documentation process began the following weekend, Rachel's professional experience with logistics systems providing structure to what might otherwise have been an overwhelming task. They established a routine that combined Owen's careful record-keeping of Natalie's communications and custody schedule changes with Rachel's systematic documentation of the tracker's presence and vehicle movements. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, showing the device clearly attached to Owen's car in various locations. Timestamps and GPS coordinates, recorded with meticulous precision, creating an undeniable record of ongoing surveillance that extended well beyond any reasonable safety concerns that might have initially justified its presence. October unfolded around them in a blaze of autumn colors, weekend outings with the children, providing natural opportunities to gather additional evidence, while simultaneously strengthening the bonds forming between their two families. Rachel noticed how Finn had begun to look forward to these gatherings, with an enthusiasm that occasionally made her heart ache with both joy and caution. Aware of how deeply children could invest in relationships that adults understood, remained tenuous and undefined. Yet she couldn't deny the natural ease with which their family units had begun to merge during these shared activities, the children developing their own dynamic that required increasingly less adult facilitation, finding common ground despite age differences and distinct personalities. Olivia had gradually emerged from her initial reserve, Rachel's genuine interest in her artistic talents and careful respect for the girl's boundaries, eventually earning tentative trust that revealed glimpses of the carefree child, who existed beneath the protective layers of premature responsibility. During an afternoon at the city park, when the younger boys were thoroughly occupied with an elaborate game involving playground equipment transformed into dinosaur habitats through the magic of imagination, Olivia had settled beside Rachel on a bench, sketchbook open to a drawing of remarkable skill for someone so young. "That's beautiful," Rachel had commented sincerely, noting the detailed rendering of the park's landscape transformed through the girl's artistic vision into something simultaneously familiar and fantastical. "Dad says I should consider art school someday," Olivia had responded, a hint of pride breaking through her careful composure. Mom says art is fine for a hobby, but not a real career. The statement carried no obvious emotion, presented as simple fact rather than complaint, yet Rachel heard clearly the conflicting messages the child was attempting to reconcile, the struggle to honor both parents' perspectives while developing her own identity. My mother was an artist, Rachel had offered carefully, sensing an opportunity for connection without pressure. She always said that creativity finds its own path. Sometimes that's a career. Sometimes it's how you approach whatever work you choose to do, but it's always valuable either way. Olivia had considered this perspective with the serious contemplation she brought to all new information, eventually nodding slightly, as though filing away the concept for future examination. "Would you want to see her work sometime?" Rachel had asked, maintaining the casual tone that seemed to put the girl most at ease. "I have some of her paintings at home. She did landscapes mostly, but with these incredible color choices that made familiar places look almost magical." The invitation had been accepted with surprising enthusiasm, Olivia's genuine interest in artistic technique temporarily overcoming her habitual caution, creating a bridge between them that existed independently of her relationship with Owen, a connection based on shared appreciation rather than circumstantial proximity. As October gave way to November, their documentation project had grown into an impressive compilation of evidence. Digital files organized chronologically and cross-referenced with incident reports detailing specific instances of interference that correlated with tracker data. Owen had scheduled an appointment with his lawyer to review the material, hope and apprehension mingling in equal measure as the meeting approached. The night before this crucial consultation, he arrived at Rachel's house after the children were settled at their respective homes, Finn with Rachel's mother for an overnight visit that had become a treasured monthly tradition, Owen's children with Natalie for her regularly scheduled Wednesday custody time that had, for once, remained unchanged. They sat at Rachel's kitchen table, the familiar space having become a sanctuary of sorts over the weeks of their developing relationship, reviewing the organized files one final time before the meeting. Rachel noticed the tension in Owen's posture, the way he repeatedly checked and rechecked details that had already been verified multiple times, his usual calm focus disrupted by the significance of what tomorrow might bring. "We've been thorough," she reminded him gently, reaching across the table to still his restless hands with her own. "The documentation is solid, consistent, and clearly shows a pattern that any reasonable person would recognize as inappropriate surveillance and interference." Owen's fingers curled around hers, the contact visibly grounding him as he took a deep breath and consciously relaxed his shoulders. "I know," he acknowledged, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just, I've been trying to create stability for the kids for so long, navigating around Natalie's moods and demands, adjusting constantly to minimize conflict." He shook his head slightly, frustration evident in the gesture. The thought of deliberately creating confrontation, of challenging the status quo directly. It goes against everything I've been doing to keep the peace for them. What if this makes everything worse instead of better? The question revealed the heart of his concern, not fear for himself, but for the potential impact on his children. The possibility that his actions might increase rather than decrease the instability in their lives. Rachel understood this worry intimately, having faced similar questions in her own journey as a single parent, weighing the short-term comfort of avoiding conflict against the long-term benefits of establishing healthier boundaries and expectations. "I can't promise it won't be difficult," she acknowledged honestly, maintaining the direct eye contact that had become characteristic of their most meaningful conversations. "But think about what you're teaching Olivia and Max by taking this step." She chose her next words carefully, aware of the weight they carried. Right now, they're learning that it's normal for one person to control another's movements, to track them without consent, to interfere with their relationships and plans without consequences. Is that really the pattern you want them to internalize as they grow up? The question contained no judgment, simply an invitation to consider the broader implications of current circumstances, the subtle lessons being absorbed by young minds still forming their understanding of healthy relationships and personal boundaries. Sometimes peace at any price isn't actually peace at all. It's just delayed confrontation with problems that keep growing beneath the surface. Owen's expression reflected the impact of her words, recognition dawning in his eyes as he considered this perspective. "You're right," he acknowledged after a thoughtful pause, his voice carrying new resolve. "I've been so focused on protecting them from conflict that I haven't considered what message my constant accommodation is sending." He squeezed her hand gently, gratitude evident in the gesture. "When did you get so wise about all this?" The question carried genuine curiosity beneath its light tone, an acknowledgement of the insight she'd offered from outside his situation, the clarity sometimes possible only from external perspective. Rachel smiled, a touch of remembered pain coloring the expression despite the years that had passed. "After Michael left, I spent months trying to shield Finn from every difficult emotion, every uncomfortable truth, convinced that was what good parenting meant in our situation. The memory still carried weight, though time had dulled its sharp edges. I was exhausted, constantly performing this idealized version of brave single mom who has everything under control, until my mother finally pointed out that I was teaching Finn, that authentic emotions had to be hidden, that vulnerability was shameful rather than human." She shook her head slightly at her younger self's well-intentioned mistakes. "Sometimes the most protective thing we can do is show our children how to face difficult situations with honesty and dignity, rather than pretending those situations don't exist." Their conversation continued late into the evening, moving from practical preparation for tomorrow's meeting to deeper explorations of parenting philosophy and personal growth. The natural evolution of dialogue between two people, discovering increasing alignment in their fundamental values, despite having arrived at those values through different paths. When Owen finally prepared to leave, standing at her door with reluctance evident in his lingering presence, Rachel felt the subtle shift in energy between them that had been building for weeks, the measured pace of their developing relationship approaching a natural turning point. He reached for her hand one last time, his fingers intertwining with hers in the now familiar gesture that had come to represent their connection. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying layers of meaning beyond their surface gratitude. "Not just for the help with documentation, but for—" He hesitated, searching for words to encompass what remained partially unspoken between them. "For seeing me. The real me, not just the version I've learned to present to the world." The vulnerability in his expression struck Rachel deeply, recognition of the rare courage required to be truly seen after experiences that had taught caution and self-protection. She stepped closer, eliminating the careful distance they had maintained until now, her free hand rising to rest lightly against his chest, where she could feel the steady acceleration of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "I see you," she confirmed softly, the simple acknowledgement containing profound acceptance of all she had come to know about him. His strengths and vulnerabilities, his fierce love for his children, his capacity for growth even through difficult circumstances. The kiss that followed felt inevitable and surprising simultaneously, a natural progression and a new beginning, gentle exploration, giving way to deeper connection as the final barriers between them dissolved in shared understanding. When they finally parted, Owen's forehead resting against hers in the quiet intimacy of the moment, Rachel felt a certainty settle within her that had been absent from her life for longer than she could remember. Not just the excitement of new romance, but the grounded recognition of something substantial taking root between them, a foundation being laid for possibilities yet to be fully imagined. The December courthouse looms over a day built on documentation and restraint, with Rachel steadying Owen while he clutches the carefully ordered record of cancellations, surveillance, and disrupted schedules. In the tense corridor outside courtroom C, they rehearse David's counsel, answer only what's asked, keep the focus on the children's best interests. while Owen voices the fear that Natalie's polished composure might eclipse the truth. A brief, chilly encounter with Natalie confirms her talent for optics and implication, but procedure cuts short the sparring. Hours later, Owen emerges changed in small, telling ways. Shoulders eased, step decisive, voice even as he says what still feels unreal. That the judge granted a modification based on the chronological clarity of the pattern and the explicit impropriety of surveillance. The victory is measured in public, spoken in careful tones and legal terms. Full physical custody, structured visitation, no last-minute cancellations without documented emergencies. Yet privately, it lands like oxygen. Rachel's relief is practical as much as emotional. Stability for Olivia and Max, predictability that lets children plan and trust. Owen's relief is braided with caution. Legally, an appeal seems untenable, but Natalie's history with defeat leaves him wary of the aftershocks. Outside in the crisp air, he acknowledges what Rachel made possible. Not only the portfolio's spine of facts, but the steadying presence that turned chaos into something nameable without escalating it. She returns the credit to his constancy as a father, refusing to let the paperwork overshadow the character it captured. What follows is celebration scaled to children's lives. Ice cream before news, framing the decision as consistency rather than conquest. The weeks to Christmas bring proof that structure can soothe, routines hold, plans stick, and even Natalie, at least for now, keeps within the new guardrails. In Rachel's house, ornaments multiply and alliances form. Finn starstruck by an almost sister, Max delighted by an older audience for dinosaur lore, Olivia warming from reserve to an affectionate, appraising ease. Amid flower storms and improbable frosting on light fixtures, Rachel and Owen trade glances that say the same thing. The strain that once tightened everything has loosened into laughter that arrives without permission. Between cookie sheets and quiet cleanup, an important word appears from Olivia, tradition, evidence that a child who learned to expect disruption now dares to imagine continuity. She proposes a yearly ornament capturing the year's meaning. For this year, a small house. The suggestion lands with the weight of recognition. They are building something that deserves an annual marker. Owen, increasingly himself in a home where vigilance isn't the default, broaches practicalities that double as commitments. His apartment won't stretch with weekday custody, and a rental house with real rooms, a yard and space for homework feels like the right next step. He asks Rachel and Finn to help choose it, folding them openly into the definition of home. By spring, they are unpacking in the chosen place, sunlight crossing half-opened boxes as laughter rearranges the backyard around a half-built swing set. The house is a fortunate convergence. Good schools, 4 bedrooms, a lease with an option that offers both stability and future choice. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Collins, brings a lilac that needs only sun and water. A living metaphor handed over in a plastic pot. Planted where it's visible from the kitchen window, it becomes their first shared, rooted commitment. Something that will bloom on schedule as the rest of their lives learns to do the same. The rhythms settle with the ordinary grace that once felt out of reach. Shared dinners amid mismatched utensils, bedtime negotiations, the taxonomy of Finn's dinosaurs, Olivia's sketches, Max's exuberant theories. On the porch, where quiet collects after lights out, Olivia's question finds its way to the surface. Are they headed toward stepmom, or is this merely practical? Owen answers with the balance that defines him now. Love first, labels later, timing guided by the children's readiness. Rachel names the quality she recognized the night the second date turned into, "My kids are outside." Not rehearsed competence, but unguarded honesty, the kind that lets real life in even when it complicates everything. Stories are retold without bitterness, only perspective. The scramble of that first night, the way truth invited something stronger than performance. Inside, a dinosaur shoe crisis briefly interrupts philosophy, and Owen answers with a flashlight and good humor, modeling the seriousness that small fears deserve without inflating them. On the steps, they keep returning to the same insight. The life they're choosing holds both logic and longing, and neither alone would have been enough. What's enduring here is not spectacle but steadiness, communication that does not hide, respect that does not wobble under strain, care enacted in 100 unshowy ways. In this chosen home, plans are both practical and symbolic, finishing the swing set at dawn because Max promised himself the sky would watch him try, placing the lilac where it will insist on beauty every spring, marking each year with an ornament that tells the truth about what changed. The legal chapter closed a door on uncertainty, but the heart of the story is how they inhabit what it opened. A pattern of showing up, of keeping promises small and large, of letting children read consistency in the details. The house is merely the container. The family is the craft that fills it, measured by patience more than grand declarations. When they finally go inside, they cross a threshold that means more than shelter. The door clicks behind them with a satisfying finality that belongs to lives aligned by choice, not accident. They are not arriving at perfect, and they don't pretend to. What they have is sturdier than that, a foundation poured from honesty, mutual regard, and the willingness to let reality, not appearances, set the terms. From a courthouse corridor to a kitchen window watching a lilac take, the arc is the same. Document what is true, act on it with courage, and let the ordinary, cookies, swings, porch tea, flashlight patrols, do the daily work of love.